This is a Google tour that will start in the year 1963, which was the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and then this tour will end in 1968 at the end of the Civil Rights Movement. You can see the destinations are all across the United States, in Mexico, and in the Middle East. We're going to move through different places that were important to the Civil Rights Movement, and we'll highlight some of those key events within the last 5 years of the Civil Rights Movement. So we're going to start by going to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was the location of a very important demonstration for the Civil Rights Movement. Here we are at the steps on the Lincoln Memorial. If you can see out in the background, this is the Washington Memorial. There's a reflection pool here, and if you turn around, we can see Abraham Lincoln, the statue of Abraham Lincoln here. And this is where the really important event called the March to Washington took place. In Washington, D.C., President Kennedy was trying to push a bill through Congress that was supporting civil rights for African Americans and attempting to desegregate public places. And Martin Luther King encouraged anyone who supported the civil rights movement to come to Washington, D.C. while this bill was going through Congress to show the congressmen how many people were in support of civil rights. And so 250,000 African Americans and 75,000 white Americans showed up here in Washington, D.C. to show their support. Here on the steps, this was where demonstrations took place, or where rallies took place, speeches that were given by the prominent leaders, and just people who were in support were congregating all around this area listening to speeches. You can see some of the pictures here of what that looked like. Here's Martin Luther King, and you can see how people just congregated all around the reflection pool. This is where the very famous speech, "I Have a Dream," took place. Martin Luther King stood and spoke about the vision he had, that he hoped that one day there would be this union of all races, and that took place here. The next place we're going to go is important to Malcolm X. So we're going to go from 1963, we're going to move to 1964. If you're familiar with Malcolm X, he was also a civil rights activist. His message was a little bit different than Martin Luther King. Both people deeply wanted rights for African Americans. They just had a different approach. Martin Luther King, he was very vocal about a unity between African Americans and white Americans, and Malcolm X was a little bit different. He spoke what we would call separatist. He felt that African Americans were just as good, if not better, than white Americans, and that he didn't even see the need to integrate, but to have equality separate from white Americans. He was under a group called the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is kind of unique to the United States. It's a branch that's a little bit different than Islam itself, but a part of his faith that he wanted to carry out was a pilgrimage to Mecca. So he came here to Mecca, which is a step that Muslims take in their faith where they go back to this holy city. And so he came here, and what he found was his group that he was associated with, called the Nation of Islam, was unique to the United States and not quite like the Islam that he saw across the world. When he came here to Mecca, he saw men and women of all races, and they were in this unified journey together. And so he came back different to the United States, and his voice in the movement changed, more of an integrationist perspective. And so when he came back to the United States, the people who were a part of his group called the Nation of Islam were not as happy with him because his message had changed. So in 1965, he is here in New York City giving a speech. At this location, he was here in a ballroom just speaking to people about civil rights. And when he approached the podium, there were loud noises. People were rushing in from behind, and I'll show you a picture here of that. People were People were rushing in from the back doors, loud noises, gunshots, and Malcolm X was shot 15 times. It was later believed that the gunmen were a part of the Nation of Islam. However, there is controversy surrounding the suspects and the people who were eventually convicted. But it is believed that the members of the Nation of Islam were people who did assassinate Malcolm X. And that was a big deal because he was a huge voice in civil rights. We're now going to go to Selma, Alabama. So this is the spring of 1965. There was a march that was planned to go from the Edmund Pettus Bridge here in Selma all the way to Montgomery, Alabama. The goal was to bring about awareness that African Americans still did not have equal access to vote. In fact, literacy tests and poll taxes were still in 1965 being used to suppress African Americans from from having a voice in government. And so that was their goal, to just walk and to bring awareness. They were met across on the other side of this bridge by policemen who attacked them. This was broadcast. There were journalists who caught this, and this really helped show again that this was a huge problem that was not changing. Regardless of laws changing, there were still very many people who were angry about equality for African Americans. The next event that we're going to go to is an event that happened in Mexico. This was in 1968, so we're jumping a little bit here towards the end of the movement. The Olympics were held in Mexico City here in the stadium. At the Olympics, there was a demonstration, and this demonstration was a demonstration to show that there was still not equality in the United States. There were two sprinters, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who had just had successful runs. They were standing on the podium, getting ready to receive their medals. The national anthem was playing. They were facing the American flag, and they raised their fists in unity together. You can see them in this picture here. This was considered a political statement, and there were a lot of people who were not very happy with this. When they were asked about what they did, they said that their point was to show that across the world that there was not equality. And so you can see those demonstrations there. People were really upset with them. They had their medals stripped when they came back to the United States. But what they wanted to show was, even in 1968 in the United States, there was not equality. We're going to go now to Martin Luther King's last speech. He was going to Tennessee. So here we are at the Mason Temple. This is the location of where he gave his last speech. Towards the end of the civil rights movement, he not only was speaking about civil rights for African Americans, but he was also speaking about poverty and the inequality that there was across the nation, that poverty was rampant. He called this the Poor People's Campaign. He was actually speaking here on behalf of sanitation workers in Memphis. And his speech was even very prophetic, this very last speech he gave. It was called "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And he talked about, better times are coming, but I might not get there with you. I encourage you to listen to this speech if you have time. It's very powerful. But he gave his last speech here. He went back to his motel that he was staying at in Memphis. Here is his motel. You can go there today. It's actually a museum, but this is where he was staying. This motel was where African Americans could stay. In the South, if you were traveling and you needed somewhere to stay and you were not white, you could not stay at a white motel. And so this was where he stayed. So he was in this room here, and he was getting ready to go to another event. He said to his musician's name was Ben, he said, "Ben, I want you to play this song, 'Take My Hand, Precious Lord.'" He was letting him know, I want you to play this song at my next event tonight. He walked out onto the balcony here, and he was shot. You can see his companions run out and are pointing in the direction of where the shots came from. And the shots were made by this man, James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was staying across the street at the White Hotel across the street, and that's where the shots came from. Today, you can go. This is the Civil Rights Museum today. You can see there are people who are going into that museum. A part of the museum is actually over here as well. So you can travel through and see the Civil Rights Museum, and you can go over to this area. They bought this section, this building, so that you could see the place where James Earl Ray was when he shot across and shot Martin Luther King. So when Martin Luther King was killed, when he was shot, he actually still had a pulse, and they took him to the hospital. He died at the hospital. They did an autopsy on his heart, and they found that his heart was actually the age of a 60-year-old. His body had gone under so much stress that it was apparent inside of his body. So this was in 1968. Martin Luther King was a huge figure in the nonviolent movement, and by this point people are so frustrated and so tired. President Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm X was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, many other leaders were assassinated. There was a man named Medgar Evers that was assassinated. There were college students who were killed trying to help African Americans register to vote. Numerous lives were killed in this process for civil rights, and by this point, the person who was so vocal about being nonviolent and turn the other cheek and take it had just been killed. And so people were very upset. On this same evening, we're going to go all the way to Indianapolis. This is where Bobby Kennedy is. Bobby Kennedy is the brother of the late John F. Kennedy. He, in 1968, was running for president. So Bobby Kennedy running for president. He was here in Indiana giving a speech, or he was supposed to give a speech, and he heard that Martin Luther King had died. And so when he heard Martin Luther King had died, he chose to go on and give his speech, and he said, he told the people, I want you to know what happened tonight. And I want you to know that I care about you, and I know what it feels like to have someone I love killed by a white man. And he tried to extend the feeling of compassion towards them, and he pleaded with them to continue Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach towards civil rights. Bobby Kennedy was a huge advocate for civil rights. He was also an advocate for the farm workers who were in the southwestern United States, in the area they were picking plants and they were picking for farmers. He was an advocate for them as well, and so he was a huge civil rights activist. You can see him here with Martin Luther King. So he pleaded with people, please don't be violent after this event. But after Martin Luther King was assassinated, there were riots across the United States. People were so frustrated. There was even a riot in Kansas City. We're here in front of the City Hall here in Kansas City, and you'll learn more about this particular event later, but Kansas City was one of 37 cities in the United States that where riots broke out after the death of Martin Luther King. Sadly, though, Bobby Kennedy is also killed. And so we go from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy and all of these people who were so vocal about civil rights are killed, to where we see the movement start to fizzle out. This is the hospital where he died. He was actually speaking as a part of his presidential campaign at a hotel in California. And he was leaving his speech. He was actually standing next to Dolores Huerta, and Dolores Huerta was she was an advocate for farm workers, to have rights for farm workers, and so he was actually there with some of the farm workers that he was supporting. And he walked into the cafeteria, the kitchen area of the hotel, and was killed by an assassin. His name was Sirhan. And so we get to the summer of 1968, and leader after leader after leader has been killed in the civil rights movement. And so we kind of start to see an end of the civil rights movement. It doesn't necessarily mean that nothing good came from this. There were many good things that came from this. Many, many, many laws changed. And segregation ended. The voting suppression, the poll taxes, and literacy tests, those things were made illegal. And so many, many good things came from this. Many laws changed that allowed for freedom of African Americans to operate in society like their counterparts, their white counterparts, to vote and to own business and to congregate in public places. And so here we are, we're back in Washington, D.C. We're at the Martin Luther King Memorial here, and you can see here's Martin Luther King, and he is looking out into the water here. And it's just symbolic here of his statue isn't even complete. If you can see, it's still kind of, it hasn't been completed, as a way to kind of show that this fight for income equality and for freedom of all people, that we're still marching forward in that, and it's not quite complete. So even though laws have changed, hearts are still in the process of changing. And so we're here at this memorial where we see that happening here. And so that's where we are at the end of the Civil Rights Movement, 1968.